Welcome back to the DYK podcast discussion series. My name is Richard Ford, and I'm your host. We are pleased and honored to visit with Dr. Ellen Staurowsky of Ithaca College. Dr. Staurowsky is an internationally recognized expert on social justice issues in sport, including gender equity in Title IX, pay equity and equal employment opportunity, college athletes' rights and the exploitation of college athletes, the faculty role in reforming college sport, the representation of women in sport media, and the misappropriation of American Indian imagery in sport. In 1998, Dr. Staurowsky co-authored the influential and often cited book titled College Athletes for Hire: The Evolution and Legacy of the NCAA Amateur Myth. In 2016, Dr. Staurowsky authored and edited Women and Sport: A Continuing Journey from Liberation to Celebration. And in 2023, Dr. Staurowsky co-authored The NCAA and the Exploitation of Profit College Athletes: An Amateurism That Never Was. In our discussion, Dr. Staurowsky provides a mini history lesson on the evolution of women's college sports and the influences that shaped it. Dr. Staurowsky also offers a candid and timely assessment of the NCAA's and Power Five's neglect of women's sports and their ironic use of Title IX and gender equity as political weapons in Congress to prevent meaningful reform for all athletes. Just a quick note, this interview was conducted on March 30th of 2023. Good afternoon, Dr. Staurowsky, and welcome to the DYK podcast.
I'm very pleased to be with you today, Richard. We're having a little bit of a cold weather here in the springtime in central New York, but I'm very delighted to be here.
Yeah, I see that. I just want to start by saying how honored and privileged I am to have the opportunity to speak with you. Your work has had a very important impact on how I see the issues in college sports and how I have framed my advocacy. It's really a challenge to try to narrow down your scholarship to an hour-long interview. But there are two pieces of scholarship that I really want to use to set the framework. The first is your 1998 book, College Athletes for Hire: The Evolution and Legacy of the NCAA's Amateurism Myth. And you co-authored that book with Professor Alan Sack. And it really is a wonderful discussion on amateurism, the myth of amateurism, amateurism as a value. You also talk quite a bit about women's sports, the history of women's sports, gender equity, Title IX, and we're going to talk about that. The second resource is your 2013 article, Cheering on the Collegiate Model, that you co-authored with Professor Richard Southall. And we're going to use both of those resources. I really want to start with gender equity issues. And you did a chapter in College Athletes for Hire titled Athletic Scholarships for Women: The Complexities of Intercollegiate Athletic Equality. And there has been this running narrative for decades now that there's a tension between the interest of profit athletes in football and men's basketball, Power Five football and men's basketball, and the interests of female athletes. And you say, to close out that chapter, you say the seemingly irreconcilable differences that manifest themselves in discussions about equality between men's and women's athletics programs derive almost solely from the credence that higher educational institutions have given to the commercial professional model. If there is one lesson to be learned from the debate and controversy surrounding women's athletics on college campuses, it is the fact that alternatives to the prevailing male model have consistently failed to penetrate the halls of power. As a consequence, women's athletics, slowly and in a controlled way, has become ever more similar to men's athletics, for good and for bad. If you could discuss how you see that now, 25 years later, and the good and the bad.
Well, let's begin with, since it's a historical reference, women's physical education was connected to medical schools or to studying in terms of exercise physiology. And that was kind of an entree point in terms of women having an opportunity to participate in physical education. And so we had these programs in women's schools that were trying to advance the interests of women to be able to play at a time when there were social prohibitions around women doing that. There were concerns about women being too weak. There a whole conception about women's generalized inferiority and frailty. So all along the way, in terms of conversations around women's access to sport, there's been this constant negotiation around under what terms and conditions women can compete. And by the time we get to the moment where I'm reflecting back on that and looking at that and looking at this relationship between what women had conceived of as a non-commercial varsity athletic opportunity for women, which was directly connected to education, versus this very professionalized entrepreneurial enterprise, which was really the framework for men's athletics. They were really working on parallel tracks. And then when we get into the 1970s with a discussion about the athletic scholarship becomes a point of contention within women's groups themselves. So the NCAA doesn't offer championships for women until they don't vote on it and decide on it until like 1981, 82. And during that window of time, that decade previous, there was the Association of Intercollegiate Athletics for Women. And originally, the AIAW had banned athletic scholarships because of the fact that they really recognized a lot of the ideas that we had that are really in contention now. I would say refer to the labor paradigm, which is that women who were operating in that time period understood that the nature of the relationship was going to change. It was going to be different if you were a coach coaching someone who is receiving money for athletic performance. As much as people pretend that that's not true, the officials pretend all the time that athletic scholarships are not for athletic performance. And
Right.
that's simply not true.
Right.
And women understood that. And they understood that there would be a change in the nature of the relationship. They understood that this was really about paying people to play athletics, which was different than an educational framework that kind of is an overarching narrative around, virtue and around becoming better and growing as a student and an individual. So we enter this whipsaw in a way because, interestingly enough, the person who brings forward this concern about women not having athletic scholarships is someone named Peachy Kellmeyer. And Kellmeyer, along with the tennis players who she was coaching in Florida at the time, they bring a lawsuit against the AIAW, Kellmeyer versus AIAW.
And when was that, Professor Staurowsky?
Circa like 1974.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah.
But Peachy Kellmeyer has a direct relationship with professional women's tennis and with Billie Jean King. And it's all within in that same period of time when the women's professional tennis players are boycotting because they want equal pay.
Right.
And so Peachy Kellmeyer looks at the situation and says, well, wait a minute, we've got these men over here who are getting athletic scholarships because of the fact that they're athletes and they're competing and they want to be taken seriously. And here we have this new law, Title IX. It's something we should have rights under. And then we have this athletic association for women, which is banning scholarships. And so they contest it. But interestingly, in that lawsuit, Kellmeyer versus AIAW, they include both claims under Title IX as well as under Title VII. And none of that ever gets litigated. And so because it becomes such an embarrassment, how do you explain to the American public that you're denying women money the way that men have it? So the AIAW steps back from that lawsuit and changes the ban and says, okay, we'll start allowing athletic scholarships. So that's way long of a story. I hope your listeners have not fallen asleep on me.
No, but it's an important one. In the time frame, Title IX was passed in 1972. There was a phase-in period to 1978. So you had a lot of jockeying at multiple levels about the interest that Title IX might benefit or harm and their perceptions of that. And you had some pushback from the power structures in college sports to the application of Title IX to the big time sports like football. But two questions from your history lesson there is a beautiful history lesson. One is in this transition from the AIAW being an autonomous, self-determinative organization that was going to set its own values and adhere to its own values into this inevitable comparison between what men have and what women have financially. Do you think that came at a cost? And then the second question is, in this phase-in period, when you had pushback, like the Tower Amendment, the Javits Amendment, Grove City, could you talk about how you see the state of gender equity from the NCAA standpoint today?
Yeah, and I'll try to put some pieces together. I
Okay.
love the question because I think it gets at both past and present. The past kind of advises what's happening in the present.
Right.
In that 1970s time period, we had the passage of Title IX in 1972. The NCAA distinguishes itself in terms of mobilizing. And as I recall, I know that they dedicated a significant amount of money to lobbying to try to have athletics completely removed
Right.
from the legislation. And then we have the number of efforts on the part of John Tower, a member of Congress who was from Texas, who was representing the football powers. And so they worked very, very aggressively to try to get athletics completely removed from the legislation. They failed in doing that. And then Jacob Javits came along from New York and effectively brought forward a kind of a compromise proposal that said, we hear that you have a concern that if a football team is outfitted with $300 worth of gear, that we expect dollar for dollar parity in terms of women, that we have to give $300 to every woman athlete to equip them, then athletic departments are going to fall apart. They're not going to have the financial resources to do that. And the expression was that Title IX would kill the goose that laid the golden egg. That was the expression that kept coming up. And so what Javits does is he comes up with a compromise, which effectively says, if you have top of the line equipment that you're using to outfit a football player, then you need to have top of the line equipment for your women field hockey players. But you do not need to have an equal expenditure. So you don't need to spend the same amount of money on men's sports as you do your women's sports. You just need to make sure that in terms of quality, that it's going to be the same for both. So that was kind of the compromise in all of that. But then the NCAA wasn't done there. So behind the scenes, they're still working because they still want athletics taken out of the application. And thus we encounter Grove City versus Bell in 1984. And Grove City is a small Christian institution in the western part of Pennsylvania. They take the position that they're not receiving federal funding in terms of their athletic department, that there's no specific federal funding that would trigger a Title IX analysis because it's not directly coming to athletes. And ultimately, that point wins the day. And there are many, many other legal issues associated
Right.
with that, so I'm condensing it down. But that's effectively what happened. And so we see the slowdown in terms of Title IX's application. And basically, it allows for schools to not comply again. So the reason why all of this resistance, all of this positioning around how Title IX is going to apply to athletic departments, and then all of these caveats and ways in which kind of like off-ramps or workarounds in terms of trying to preserve men's sports and the power of men's sports. It's kind of sprinkled throughout the regulatory structure. So we've got something called the contact sport exemption within the regulations, which expressly set aside sports like football, wrestling, baseball, basketball, and others, so that if there was no sport for women being offered, and Title IX would require that if she was good enough to play on an existing men's team, there would be an obligation to do so. A woman would be competing in tennis, golf, swimming, but those revenue-producing sports and those contact sports were given an exemption, which still exists today. And all of this was based on this assumption that women were not interested in sport. And we see it in the three-part test of athletic participation opportunities. You only have to pass one of the three tests, the
Right.
first one being, how are your athletic opportunities proportional to
Right.
enrollment? If they're not, have you had a history and continuing practice of program expansion? If not, are you accommodating interest and ability? And there was this strong belief that kept getting repeated over and over and over again, even though it wasn't true, but it was getting repeated, that women just weren't interested in sports. And so throughout the entire regulatory system, you have all of these outs for the men's power structure that allow for all of this resistance. And so by the time we get to the 21st century, by the time we get to the NCAA women's tournament in 2021, we have that viral moment that was inspired by Sedona Prince,
Right.
where she's, side by side showing that the inequities in terms of what the men had and what the women had. So the reason why this is so important is that today, as we talk about compensation rights for athletes, and as we try to think about what a 21st century vision would be, we get this whole discussion about, well, what's going to happen in terms of Title IX? What's going to happen in terms of fairness to women? There has never been fairness to women in this system. And the manipulation of Title IX in this discussion should be an affront to anyone who really cares about civil rights and about what it's really intended to be. Because how powerful of an institution do you have that can take a piece of civil rights and actually use it to threaten the prospect of change on behalf of all athletes in a system that is exploitative in every possible way? It's just a matter of magnitude. We have football players who are getting compensated more in terms of endorsements right now, but to say that we should stop that from happening because we need to comply with Title IX. This system has demonstrated for 50 years, and we're in the 50th anniversary.
Right.
Study after study after study shows that there is massive non-compliance throughout the entire system. So this is all kind of like a political shell game. And women athletes have actually benefited from endorsements far more than being threatened by that process.
Yeah, Dr. Staurowsky, that's such an important point that you just made about the NCAA and Power Five and their lobbyists and lawyers and their congressional engagement and their public-facing narratives, that they have said that if we do anything from an equity or financial standpoint to recognize the value of Power Five football and men's basketball players, then that necessarily means that we're stealing money and equity from female athletes in the Power Five. And they've used that as a wedge argument. I have argued that we don't live in a zero-sum financial world in college sports or a zero-sum equity world. There's plenty of money and equity to go around. We talked a little bit before we started recording about the hearing yesterday. Today's March 30th, 2023. There was a hearing yesterday in a subcommittee of House Energy and Commerce, the Innovation, Data, and Commerce Subcommittee. The Title IX issue came up again and again and again. That was a talking point. It's a theme that's been used in the congressional engagement. How do you see that as a political tool? And do you think that it's going to have resonance?
Yeah, a twofold response to that. The continuing invocation of Title IX in these discussions from the standpoint, instead of asking the question, why is it that we have a multi-billion-dollar industry for men's college sport and a multi-million-dollar industry for women's sport, and raising the Title IX question, which is, why have schools not been held responsible for their neglect in marketing women's sports and depriving them of the opportunity for audiences and for revenue, which is exactly and precisely what has happened. Schools, one of the provisions under Title IX is that schools need to provide equitable opportunities in terms of marketing and promotion. That has not happened.
Right.
Not even in the vicinity has it happened. So it's no wonder that as we're talking about this economic system, it's no wonder that we have a multi-billion-dollar industry in terms of football and men's basketball, and that we have a multi-million-dollar industry. This is conscious and intentional. It's not accidental. It isn't that people in the United States aren't interested in women's sports. Increasingly, we're finding out quite the opposite. But instead of focusing their attention on holding schools accountable to Title IX compliance, to asking critical questions about why it is we have this economic structure the way that we do, instead of doing that, they turn around and they use Title IX as a weapon,
Right.
where they somehow imply that if in a discussion about athlete compensation, if we throw up the red flag and say, well, what about women? They're not getting as much as men are. That's absolutely true right now. But the plain fact of the matter is that since the ban on endorsements was lifted off of the NCAA regulatory system, we have seen far more women who are being promoted, far more women who are making more money than they ever have, and far more money. They're doing it on their own, not because of their institutions. Their
Right.
institutions have failed them. So this is just, a red herring. And so the first piece of my response is this is a misdirection and
Right.
misinformation. The second part of it is it has historically worked, and it's played off of a general idea that Americans have. When you look at these general polls about how Americans generally feel about Title IX as a gender equity piece of legislation, they have a general favorable feeling for it.
Right.
So if you put out a message that says, well, the women aren't being treated fairly, that's not right, and the men have something to do with that, then it's pretty effective in terms of slowing things down. But two takeaways. Number one, the system is not and has not been and has not demonstrated that it is committed to gender equity in any way, shape, or form. And number two, that the tell in terms of the lie is that we can see it with the women athletes who are operating in that endorsement sector right now. We've got Olivia Dunn with, $1 million and more. And I know no cap sports knows this better than I do, but the value of women athletes in that space are much more than what the system would have suggested that they were just 2 or 3 years ago.
Wow, that's such a powerful point, Dr. Staurowsky, that when you get the NCAA out of the way and their historic resistance to true gender equity, women can compete in the marketplace on more equal terms. The exposure issue is an issue too. I've always thought that women's college basketball and women's soccer had the potential to really have, more market value than's been realized. But if you're not promoting those sports, and that came through with the Kaplan report, what happened in 2021, and how the CBS Turner contract is structured, and then the residual content through some very small contracts with ESPN puts women's basketball in a really difficult spot. And that Turner contract goes into 2032. So they're locked in these long-term contracts. And how do you break out of that? The Kaplan report had some interesting recommendations on that, but we still have the status quo as I see it. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, for all of the rhetoric in terms of change, the idea that somehow there was a change because of the fact that the women's basketball tournament now had access to being called March Madness as well. That's not a substantive change. I think that relative to the way in which those television contracts were packaged, and again, it's another tell in the system when you drill down and you really look at what the dynamic is, because here you have an entity, the NCAA, that has built its business model post 1984 when they lost football. But they built its business model on the promotion of men's basketball. And so as an industry, they've demonstrated the fact that the one thing that they know how to do is they know how to promote basketball and to promote it at a global level in a multi-billion-dollar sport entertainment industry. That is the one thing that you know about the NCAA. So the fact that they have the premier women's basketball tournament in the world, that they've got it. The
Right.
fact that this is bringing in $16 million per year, you have to work at that. That you, you have to work at suppressing value
Yes.
in order to achieve that. And that was one of the outcomes that came out of the Kaplan report, is that 16 million really ought to have been something in the vicinity of, it's been a long day. I think it might have been as much as 185, but
Yeah.
listeners, please fact check
Yeah.
me on that.
Yeah.
Because I may have overstated that a bit. But if you think about this in terms of compounding interest over time, the NCAA had that tournament for women in the early 1980s. How that long span of time, decades of deprivation, it's valued, even modestly at 180 now. It would have been so much more if it had been tended to properly. And it was wrapped, the women's basketball tournament was bundled with 19 or 18 other championships,
That's
18
right.
or 19
Right.
other championships. So you
Right.
suppress the value of all of those. And we also see it in terms of sports like softball, for example. We know that softball has competed very, very well in terms of the Women's Softball World Series as a case in point. It's competed very well from a television rating perspective with the NHL. And that's without really trying, So there are opportunities there. And the thing that confounds me quite a bit is that, just given kind of American capitalism, it does really confound my thinking that they're leaving so much money on the table,
Yes.
both in terms of the way that they exploit the labor force, and also in terms of suppressing the value of selected sports. Because after they lifted the endorsement ban, there's a projection that about $1 billion in terms of endorsements is going to be flowing into the system for athletes. And that's not taking money away from other things. That was money that was left on the table, and some portion of that money, and we'll never know what portion that was, but that money, some portion of that money was already there because it was being traded under the table.
Yeah, and that brings us square back to I'm searching through College Athletes for Hire for the quote. And I just have to show you. This is my dog-eared copy of
Okay.
College Athletes for Hire.
Do you mind if I derail this a little bit and just show you what's on my desk?
Oh, nice. Nice. That's Dick
Yeah,
DeVenzio's book, 1986 Rip Off You. That's
yeah,
great.
rip off you.
Yeah.
I thought
Um,
you'd enjoy that.
I love that. But in that chapter 7, you observed that one of the problems is that the patriarchy that has inserted itself into Title IX in the 70s to really take over women's sports and control it, that the decision makers were overwhelmingly men. And
Mhm.
I think I'd like to get your thoughts on how you see that today, and whether we still have that same problem at the decision-making level in the voluntary regulation of college sports.
Mhm. Things are getting a little bit better on that front, but if you look at the Power Five, I believe there are actually a couple of women who are ADs at the Power Five level.
Right.
It's a handful of women. I'm thinking at Vanderbilt and Virginia as two cases in point there, and there's some others as well. In large part, the power structure really has not changed from a values perspective. And even the arrangement of the overall structure itself remains very much intact, and seems to be impervious
Yes.
to any kind of lawsuit, any kind of genuine transformation. I know that there's a lot of talk right now about the NCAA going through a transformation, and I don't even understand
Uh,
it, apart from the fact that it's a branding issue.
Right.
Anyone who follows college sport could not seriously think that this is transformational in any way.
No,
Um,
I did a couple of episodes on that. The misdirection in that final report is stunning, honestly. And I've read all the minutes of the meetings over the year. I paid very close attention to what that committee was doing. They're transforming us right back to the 1950s.
exactly,
That's
exactly.
transformation. And on the AD issue, I'm glad you raised that, because that's what I was thinking about when I asked that question about whether things had changed. And when you look at the FBS athletics directors, I think 90% are men.
Yeah,
Mentioned UVA, Carla Williams, I believe, at UVA. I wanted to get in Nina King at my alma mater, Duke,
nice.
right? And she was
Yes.
just recently hired. But when you look at the landscape, it's still very, very much male and white male. And the Big 12 athletics directors, when you look at a composite photo, it looks like a fraternity from the 1940s,
Yeah,
all
yeah,
white men.
yeah,
And on all these issues and calls for reform, the voluntary regulation of college sports, athletes' rights, as long as we have the same people making decisions who created this mess, it's never going to change. And
yeah.
the imperviousness to change, I think, is so important. And do you see any pathway at the voluntary regulatory level to change who's sitting in those decision making chairs?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Richard Lapchick,
Yes.
who does the racial and gender
Hmm.
report cards on
Hmm.
both professional sport organizations as well as on the NCAA. And I've found it very interesting over the years to see that the college sports sector actually scores lower than almost every professional sport entity. I find that deeply problematic from the standpoint that there's so much rhetoric in higher education and frankly, federal law that is supposed to be compelling us to do better in terms of gender, race, and all areas of equity. And institutions are required to attest to the fact they're abiding by all of these rules in order to receive federal research dollars and other kinds of federal funding. And yet, clearly, when we go in and we look at things, they're not doing that. And it really raises a question for me in terms of why the United States government is so kind of intentionally inattentive
Right.
to that disconnection. And that reality would suggest that things are not going to change anytime soon. So I don't think the system voluntarily is going to change. And
Right.
when we look at the number of lawsuits over time, and when we look at the number of athletes who are suing this entity, if we look at the 300 concussion cases, I mean,
Right.
that's breathtaking for an entity that says that it's committed to the health and safety of athletes. And all of these athletes feel that they need to take a legal route because they have no other remedy. And then in the compensation areas, we've had just legions and legions of people across the entire country who've been working on this at so many different levels to try to unlock it. And in the education area, the graduation rates, there's a whole shell game going on there in terms of what the claims are. So in almost every single area of claim, and college sport people are perpetuating this narrative that this is all about the athletes. And what the real narrative is that this is all about corporate interest and power.
Yes.
And the athletes are the least considered. They're the cost of doing business. And this is kind of a classic labor problem, right? That employers will not kind of willingly make changes on their own. It tends not to happen that way. And the NCAA has demonstrated over and over and over again, along with the conferences and along with the schools, that they are not going to change willingly.
I want to go back to the demise of the AIAW
Yeah.
and then kind of press fast forward to some growth that we've seen in women's sports. And two questions really. One, do you think that there was loss of autonomy with the death of the AIAW in terms of defining your values, women's sports values as a kind of a standalone kind of product? And then second, do you think that today, judging the progress in women's sports through the financial yardstick and comparing it to men's sports, is that the right yardstick? And does that perhaps reflect a surrender of values over time?
Yeah. I think this conception that Alan and I wrote about in College Athletes for Hire in terms of this educational model versus a commercial model. I I think that the commercial model has really overtaken all of our sports structures all the way through to the youth level. So the America that we're living in today in terms of sports nation, I think is dramatically
Right,
different
right,
than what it was even at the time when we were writing our book. And what that has kind of required is in terms of women's sports is that invariably, when there have been attempts to exert autonomy, when there have been attempts to take a path that seems to be more woman centered, that within this overarching structure, which is so male dominated, that those efforts really fall by the wayside. And that's kind of the nature of a hegemonic system. That the predominant value system, which is a male value system, men's sports value system, that all of the standards of performance are applied across the board for both men and women. And it doesn't help when you were asking me earlier about, the leadership structure and who's in positions of decision making.
Hmm.
In terms of the average athletic program in the United States, there are only, out of every 10 head coaches, only 2 are women. Back in the 1970s, over 90% of the head coaches of women's sports were women. Today, that figure has consistently been between 47 and 48% of head coaches of women's teams are women, which means when you look at an entire athletic program, 2 in 10 head coaches across the board are women. And that puts women in a very precarious situation, because when you're trying to advocate, which is a job requirement for any coach, the dynamic is so men's focused.
Right.
There are vulnerabilities associated with navigating that space. And where we see it playing out is we see it playing out in terms of how we relate to a lot of the coach abuse cases that involve head coaches of women's sports. And it raises this whole question around exactly what's going on there. Is it that we just can't tolerate assertive behavior on behalf of women, or are they genuinely abusive? Then we get into the complication of if the whole coaching system is abusive,
Right.
and we have more tolerance for men abusing, then that's a deeply problematic issue at so many different levels. So
Yes.
I've kind of taken us in a direction maybe that's not helpful.
No, but it's very interesting and important, because I think that goes to climate and culture
Yeah.
across the board for men's and women's sports. So you mentioned the hegemonic authority. That's a great segue into the 2013 article, Cheering on the Collegiate Model, where the hegemon plays an important role through the lens of propaganda. But what I want to talk to you about in the context of the collegiate model is this third prong that Miles Brand articulated in his 2006 State of the Association speech on the financial framework, and this notion that we have a duty, a mandate to maximize revenue in football and men's basketball. And that's okay on the input side, so long as on the output side, we're spending it on downstream beneficiaries who can't pay for themselves. And that expenditure is consistent with our nonprofit mission and justifiable under principles of higher education and values of higher education. Implicit in that, I think he doesn't say this, but I think a consequence of this current debate about the impact of female athletes on paying football and men's basketball players is the myth of the self-sustaining athletics department. That model seems to assume that the athletics departments are fully self-sustaining and that the only source of revenue to support the rest of the athletics department is football and men's basketball. That can only exist at 40 or 50 schools. And for the rest of the NCAA, they're using direct institutional support in whole or in part. And this argument with those 40 or 50 athletics departments that do generate enough revenue to pay for all the downstream sports, outside of that, schools have to decide every year how much they're going to spend on sports, what the values are, and how they're going to field men's versus women's sports. When you look at the collegiate model now and the consequence of it, do you believe that's an appropriate distinction, the self-sustaining model versus the rest of the NCAA, 95% of the NCAA that has to pay from the university side? If you could talk a little bit about what that means.
Yeah. I feared coming in to chat with you today that my go-to term was going to be it's complicated. It is complicated, but I think it's complicated because of the frameworks.
Right.
And the one thing I have learned, and really going back and looking at how the NCAA evolved, especially in the 1950s, as college football was being taken up by television.
Hmm.
Whole juxtaposition of collegiate model plays off of the distinction between what's happening in the college sports system versus what's happening in the professional sports system. And all of that has been embedded in the NCAA manual and in talking points. So,
Right.
this notion of a clear line of demarcation
Right.
between college and professional sports, and that the rule structure that was in place for the NCAA was intended to protect athletes from the distortions that would occur and the pressures that would come from the professional model. And so here we have an NCAA president in 2006 who is saying effectively, in American capitalism, we're going to operate like the business that we are. We have enough power that we're going to make determinations as to where that money goes. We've got so much power that we can actually deprive the people who have labored for that money, and we can actually take it out of their bank account and we can distribute it as we wish. But it all hinges on this belief that somehow there's something corrupt about a professional sport model in relationship to this virtuous collegiate model. To me, when I go back and I look at where that language actually came from, this didn't have anything to do with education. It didn't have anything to do with protecting athletes in terms of their welfare or in terms of being protected from people who might be predatory, for example, that it was actually reserving the rights of the college sports system to do what it wanted in terms of its own business interests. And Fritz Kreisler is quoted as saying, and of course this is hearsay, but in Byers' book, Fritz Kreisler, when he's talking about how he understands the athletic scholarship as pay for play, he says, we are reserving the right to professionalize our athletes. We are reserving our rights. And I'm paraphrasing on that. But Byers inserts that story. And this is really, it's a juxtaposition in terms of college football versus professional football. They're battling for television rights. The NCAA is making some mistakes in terms of how it's using television. The NFL is getting more successful at using television. So the clear line of demarcation is about branding and business and positioning in terms of sport properties. It's not about preserving some educational concept.
Right.
And so that carries forward in terms of women's relationship to all of this, because women were genuinely, in terms of the AIAW, they were genuinely trying to create a different model that was connected to an educational framework. So they were really talking an entirely different language. All of that kind of gets co-opted and taken over and repeated. And then we get into this conversation around the sustainability of athletic department finance and what the expectations are. I think we've got state laws that require for some athletic departments all that they do have to be self-sustaining.
Right.
So we've got that built into a legal structure at the state level. But we also have this complicated issue of how do we assess what it means for an entity like this that is designated as a nonprofit to somehow demonstrate profitability. For example, I know that we've got the data that says that only 50 schools are actually making money.
Right.
To me, that's not a surprising thing for entities that are designated as nonprofit. And schools want to be seen that way. They want to be seen as nonprofit, as educational, because they're reaping the benefits of that. I'm not particularly concerned with whether or not a school is actually technically showing a profit, because with every kind of initiative on the part of an athlete where there was a need for more money to be found, in every single circumstance, the system has always found the money.
Yeah.
In 1972, they're saying Title IX is going to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. No, It's a multi-billion-dollar industry in terms of college football. Title IX did not put a ding in that engine. If we go to O'Bannon and frankly White before that, and we could go back further than that, but the cost of attendance stipends, for example, the rhetoric at that time was, this is going to break the system. We can't afford it.
Right. Right.
They found the money. The educationally related benefits flowing out of Alston, they're finding the money. The money is there. When we look at the endorsements space, the money is there. I'm not so sure that the sustainability concern, particularly helpful in terms of getting to a space where we need to be in terms of something that genuinely happens on behalf of athletes.
Yeah, when you were talking, I was thinking about the Stanford University situation. In 2020, they canceled 11 sports.
Yeah.
There was enormous pushback from alumni and stakeholders. And the response, Stanford University's response, they published some very detailed FAQs. And I think they did a pretty good job of trying to explain themselves. They at least did that, which we don't get a lot of. But implied in their response was, we just can't find the next penny. And we've looked high and low, but only within the athletics department. And then you had two lawsuits. One was kind of a breach of contract suit. There was also a Title IX suit. And all of a sudden they found that penny. That was an example that kind of had me thinking, look, this myth of the self-sustaining athletics department at one of the richest universities on the planet with a $30 billion endowment can't find some extra money, a couple $1 million to fund these sports. And I just thought that was a ridiculous argument to make. But that's the way that the big Power Five schools think about the issues. That also brings up an interesting question I wanted to ask you about the collegiate model and the way that it's framed, that financial framework. There really isn't an upper limit on it. You know, Miles Brand in 2006 was saying we still have to do this within the values of higher education. But theoretically, in terms of the model, there's no upper limit because you always have incentive to maximize revenue because your expenditure is consistent with your nonprofit purpose, right? Do you think that as a practical matter, there are any limits at the values level and the decision makers in terms of saying, wait, there's a point at which it crosses the line into overt professionalism?
Yeah. Well, and I can't locate in my memory bank right now exactly what year this was, but there was a Knight Commission program in DC, the way that they periodically do every year. You know, there are a couple that they host in DC every year, panels. And memorably, there was an executive from CBS Sports that was on one of the panels one year. And there was this discussion kind of along the lines of what you're talking about in terms, actually, it had to do with scheduling of games. And during that time period when we were adjusting to the fact that we were going to have kind of like 24/7 coverage of college sport, and that we were going to see games that were happening every night of the week. And there was discussions around disruptions to academics and travel schedules and that kind of thing. And the television executive, expressly said, please don't ask us about this, because we're not going to back off from the table on this. This would have to be something that the college presidents, that the athletic directors, that the conference commissioners, those are the people who would have to say that enough is enough. But as long as they're agreeing to it, as long as they're doing it and not saying no to it, then we're going to continue to do it. And that actually was at a time when we hadn't seen the full blown like Longhorn Network, SEC Network, and that kind of thing. And so I thought it was very telling that a television executive was saying, situating where that decision needed to come from. And clearly, if there is no decision maker within the college sports space that is setting a limit, then it just keeps going and going.
Yes. You mentioned the Knight Commission and you mentioned presidential leadership. And of course, that presidential leadership theme really goes back to the Carnegie Report in 1929 and Henry Pritchett's his introduction, where he says, look, they're talking about college football. I thought it was an indictment of big time football at the time. But he said, look, the buck should stop with the university presidents. You know, when you're looking at the voluntary regulation of college sports, the buck stops there. The Knight Commission picked up on that in 1989. Their first report in 1991, Keeping Faith with the Student Athlete, was built around that central principle. Yet it seems that the university presidents have been AWOL over the last several years, and particularly the Power Five presidents. Yet the principle of institutional control and responsibility is still in the NCAA Constitution, even after this constitutional makeover. How do you see the role of presidents? And do you think that at the Power Five level, there are any university presidents who look at this and say, this is ridiculous and we want to change the business model?
Yeah. I'm sure as a general observation, given the fact that there are 1,100 schools out there, I'm sure that there are some college presidents who are trying to actively work to rein in the commercial aspects. Having said that, though, I think given the moment in time that we're in, with all of these things happening, the sheer number of lawsuits that we've seen, the significance of those lawsuits, the amount of money, even the hiring of former Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker as the NCAA president. I don't think that we are going to see significant leadership coming out of that group. And I mean, I have my ideas on why that is, but I think there might be some other people who might be better versed in terms of maybe thinking through the reasons why. But clearly, the powers that be want this system to be as it is. And that's abundantly clear to me. They do have the opportunity to intercede. They do have the opportunity to change, and they don't. I would say the one thing in terms of that institutional control, the conception of it, is that it creates certain kinds of firewalls. And the biggest firewall, of course, is the fact that board of trustees are not mentioned at all. And no president is going to be able to challenge a high-powered football coach or men's basketball coach or women's basketball coach in a particular state if they don't have the backing from their board. And I think that is a firewall there. And then the other firewall is this whole head coach responsibility stipulation, which is newer. But what I think it does is I think that was put in there to kind of protect college presidents from being accountable.
Yes.
So they were intentionally passing the buck. And head coaches had been doing that for years, passing the buck to their assistants. And to me, it was just out of that same playbook. But I think that is important because ultimately it is the board of trustees, fiduciaries, who really have that responsibility. And it's intentionally silent in terms of any kind of responsibility. So I think we've got that going on.
Yeah. So, Dr. Staurowsky, I'm going to ask you to pull out your crystal ball. And I would love your thoughts on what you think college sports is going to look like, the Power Five, at least in 5 years. And what do you, aside from how you think it's going to look, what do you want it to look like?
Yeah. I think I'm going to flip that and say what I would like it to look like and then what I fear may happen.
Okay.
I think this is a labor issue. I think that this has been a labor negotiation that has been going on from 1906 to the present, where there's only been one party at the table.
Yes.
And I think that's the reason why the system is as dysfunctional as it is. There's a whole management theory that more of a disconnection there is between what an organization says it does versus what it actually does. More vulnerable it is in terms of challenges. And I think that the NCAA is very much an example. And frankly, when I say the NCAA, I'm also talking about the conferences and the member schools as well. It's a combination of all of those things, which all comprise the association. But there is no will within the association to live up to the three pillars of what they say that they do. They say that they put as primary considerations the educational interests of athletes, the health and safety of athletes, and that the issue of fairness and fair treatment is uppermost. And across all three, they've gone into court and denied responsibility. So that doesn't bode for anything good. And so I really believe that we need an infrastructure, which is an athlete representational association. People press me about, does that mean that it would be a union? I know there are a lot of complications associated with that. I still think that we need some kind of an association which is independent of the NCAA and the conferences, that represents the interests solely and completely of athletes and is not wrapped up in the conflicts of interest that all of these other people have in terms of the profit-making efforts of the business. And until that happens, I don't see any meaningful change occurring. What I fear is going to happen is that, and Richard, you did such a magnificent job at the College Sport Research Institute when you were showing how something like the Wicker Bill, for example, how the behind the scenes sort of negotiating around the status of athletes, the efforts that are being made behind the backs of athletes about these significant legislative actions that will have dramatic impact on their lives, that they have no meaningful a notice about, no representation, no one coming in to tell them what the implications of these laws are or the proposed laws are. And the mobilization of resources to try to get Congress to act in some way to give the NCAA the antitrust exemption that they've been trying to get for so long, to have embedded that there would be a federal law that would deny employment status to athletes. There were efforts already in Ohio and Michigan to do that.
Right.
And under the quiet of night, very few people know about it. I think it's the same kind of playbook that's happening in Congress right now. And so I'm very, very concerned that the public perception is that athletes are gaining ground. And I think that's a false impression. I think there's activity there, but there's a difference between activity versus power. Athletes have no more power now than they did before O'Bannon. They're getting, a little bit more in terms of compensation, but they don't have any more power. And that, to me, that's the systemic correction.
Yeah. And that's what we're trying to do with DYK, is to get some of this information out there in a way that we hope athletes will be engaged by. And discussions like this are so important, Dr. Staurowsky, because the athletes need to hear this. And what you just said is it. I mean, they're on the clock. I think the athletes are on the clock and they don't even know it.
Right.
Right.
I would agree with that 100%. They don't even know that where the game is being played.
Right.
That, there's been such a push in terms of personal branding and in terms of endorsements, and this pumping out of all this drama around the transfer portal and NIL and all of that. And to me, it's all just a misdirection. It's kind of like, that is not the game. Labor is the game.
Right.
Finding a meaningful power structure where athletes know what is being done to them by this power structure. And all of this pretense that the NCAA has around athletes increasing, having a role within the association. I mean, you've got to be kidding me. The idea that a young person would walk into those rooms with people who are lawyers, people who have written the rule books, the NCAA staff that has access to all of that previous information, people who've been working for decades in this space, the idea that somehow that's leveling the playing field, it's so patently untruthful, manipulative. And it doesn't take anything away from the athletes who are learning, participating, and trying to do good within that structure. But there's just no way that you can have one athlete sitting on a committee with all of those other people who outrank them, and somehow, and without representation,
Right.
and somehow lead to a good outcome. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. So I fibbed. I do have one more question. Uh,
If you're willing to put up with me, I'm a little
Ellen,
worried about
I could
your
go on for hours. I just want to say this. If you're okay with it, I really want to have you back on as we launch and we're getting some of this information out there because the breadth of your work, I mean, it was very challenging for me to structure this interview because there's so many different directions we could go. And, you've raised so many important points that could be a separate episode. So I would love to have you back. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about the new book that's coming out, the NCAA and the Exploitation of College Profit Athletes and Amateurism That Never Was. And you co-authored that book with Professor Southall, Professor Mark Nagel, also at South Carolina, Rick Karcher at Eastern Michigan, forgetting one.
Joel Maxey, former colleague of mine at Drexel.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. And CSRI, there were a couple of copies out there on the desk and I thumbed through it. And you wrote a chapter. I don't know. How many chapters did you write for that book?
3 or 4.
Okay.
3 or 4.
I just happened to land on your discussion of the Northwestern case.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to talk to you about that. And that book's going to come out, what, in 6 weeks, maybe?
May. Yeah.
May.
It's
Yeah. So
about
I've
6 weeks. Yeah.
I've pre-ordered my copy. I'm going to send it to you and ask you to autograph it. If that's okay. And then,
I'd be honored.
but how do you, in looking at that work, and it appears as if it's a grand synthesis of all these issues that you and your colleagues have been talking about so beautifully for decades,
Mhm.
right? So is that a book that you think is going to be accessible to the regular consumer fan of college sports or athletes? Where do you see it fitting in the market?
Yeah. Um, I think whenever we do books like this, there are a couple of considerations. So we were certainly at least, actually, I can only speak for myself on this, but this is what goes through my mind when I write. I always have the faces of my students and athletes who I've met very much in my mind. And
Hmm.
so I try to think I'm writing for them. So that's a big consideration for me. And then along with that, we did make an effort to try to have this be a general readership book as well,
Okay.
for the very purpose that you're talking about. How do we get this information out? I was talking with a reporter yesterday, and who is also a lawyer, and she was just flabbergasted at kind of sort of the expanse of the this regulatory system that had imposed these rules unilaterally on
Right.
athletes with such negative consequences. And she just wasn't aware of it. And she's a sports person, but she just wasn't aware of it. And so the motivation behind the book is to try to make this information available, and to really focus, really trying to strip away that narrative that the NCAA has that comes up to the fore during March Madness, which is all about the quote unquote kids, which is again it's a manufactured
Yeah.
branding issue to really kind of blow the whistle on the system to say, we know what you're pretending to be, but we also know that this is all about labor. And that it
Right.
would be most helpful if you really want to understand the system, then start with the premise that this is not about amateurism and that amateurism actually never was. And the very conception of it is something that schools should not even accept as a premise. There's a lot of discussion in the early history moving up into the hearing yesterday on Capitol Hill with this term amateurism. This comes out of the late 1800s and is designed to be exclusionary in terms of the lower classes and in terms of racial groups. And it's connected to a white power structure.
Right.
So the idea that in 21st century America that higher education institutions would actively promote this as a defense for the indefensible is something that they really need to be called out on. And that's a premise behind our book, to say this is an amateurism that never was to begin with. Schools shouldn't be subscribing to it and promoting it, and that this is really about labor.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait for it to come out. I'm really excited for it. And I just
Thank
want
you.
to thank you again for giving us your time. This has been a really fun discussion. I love talking to you, and it was a pleasure to finally meet you at the conference. And I look forward to talking to you more about this, the way that we can get this information to the athletes. Thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure, Richard. And I have to say I'm a little powered up. I generally don't drink caffeine, but I've had a few sips of caffeine, so I'm a little bit hyped up right now. But thank you so much for allowing me to join you. And it's an honor and a privilege to be on with you and for all the incredible work that you've done. It's been inspiring to me.
Well, thank you. That's very high praise.